Greetings, gentlemen. I've been wanting to talk about this topic for a while, and I should say at the outset that this video is not directed to any one person. I am talking about this topic because it is brought up quite frequently with respects to arguments about biology and social conditioning, etc., etc. Now, what I'm going to call this is behavioral non-equivalence. And the argument that we frequently see from many, many people is that just as human beings have learned to curb and limit their violent tendencies, so too can human beings learn to curb and limit their natural tendencies to favor women over men. Now, I call this behavioral non-equivalence because the two are simply not equivalent. So let's spend a while talking about violence first and how it's not equivalent to favoring women. And once again, this is not directed to any one specific person. It's just a counter to an argument that we've heard very, very often. Human violence is something that's been with us since the beginning, since before we were humans, since we were Homo erectus and all of our pre-hominid ancestors. We see violence amongst chimpanzees, and we even see violence amongst dolphins, bottlenose dolphins in particular, well documented. And certainly the past, up until fairly recently, has been incredibly bloody and incredibly horrific and violent. Just a few hundred years ago, we were impaling people on wooden stakes, leaving them out to rot in the sun, burning people alive, torturing people on racks, having people torn apart by horses, hanging people, decapitating people, you name it. And the Romans, for example, tried to reenact the famous poisoning of Hercules by the jealous wife of Zeus, Hera, and he was allegedly put on fire by this poison, or rather there was a feeling of burning, and so he ultimately died. And so there was a time in the Roman Colosseum where slaves primarily would have tunics put on them. It was called the tunica molesta, and they would be lit on fire with a substance. Nobody knows exactly what the substance was, and burned alive. They used to use roasting wheels to roast human beings alive. I mean, we used to do horrible things that I personally, and I think most of you, would find absolutely repugnant. And most people looked at this as entertainment. No matter what the proclamations of the church or government officials might have been back in the day, people enjoyed watching public burnings, public executions. It was entertainment, essentially. So too the gladiatorial games. People would be torn apart by lions and tigers. And you don't need to go that far back to see just how bad things were. Now, perhaps not in sheer brutality, but the 20th century, certainly in just numbers, sheer numbers, quantity, was just probably the most violent century in our history, if only due to the numbers and the technology involved. And for the first time in the history of the world, man harnessed the power of the atom, and we incinerated hundreds of thousands of people instantly, or near instantly. Have we made progress since then? I think we have. We've made a lot of progress since then. And we don't commit that sort of violence anymore in general. Even in a place such as Saudi Arabia, which still has public beheadings and amputations, people aren't burnt alive, to our knowledge. They aren't drawn and quartered. They aren't impaled on stakes, etc. So even in a place like that, we've made progress. And look at Western society or industrialized nations in general. Even the countries that have a policy of execution, a death penalty, they generally don't do that kind of stuff. So, and look at our death penalties in the states that still have it. It's lethal injection, pretty painless, and it's over fairly quickly. Compared to electrocution, firing squad, hangings, etc. At hanging, people were hanged quite frequently up until recently. And we've made a lot of progress since then. We are a much more civil society, and I'm not just using that in air quotes. Generally speaking, we don't do those things anymore. It's very rare. And when we do see them, we're shocked, horrified, and we can't really relate to it. Now, one of the reasons why violence has receded, and there's so many, but is because it's so in your face and so apparent, and it's so destructive. The fact that combination of it being in your face and so apparent, along with its destruction or destructive capacity, really incentivizes people who want to live and function in a civilized society to no longer want to participate in that sort of thing. That is to say, engaging in violent action for the sake of pleasure or entertainment or what have you, yes, that still exists, boxing, cage fighting, etc., but it's a very small number of people that actually do that, and a fairly small number of people who watch that. Most people don't enjoy overt displays of violence, and they don't enjoy overt displays of inflicting harm on others, because that is counterproductive. In the modern era, in the early 21st century, we've created a society, more or less, with lots of flaws and faults, mind you, that does not incentivize violent behavior. In fact, it's the more peaceable, trade-oriented behavior, the nonviolent behavior that is encouraged. And generally speaking, that's the way people get ahead. That's the way people make progress in their lives. And that's the way people coexist. A few centuries ago, it might have been more prudent in the sense of getting ahead, taking a band of thugs or bandits and robbing the local village and killing everyone and raping the women and etc. That might have been an air quotes prudent decision. We don't do that anymore, and that's not really socially sanctioned either. In fact, people who do that are de-incentivized because they're going to get punished. We have a relatively robust and efficient system of crime and punishment in our society. I'm speaking of Western society in general. So, people don't have the incentive to engage in that. In fact, they receive the opposite incentive. They're encouraged to engage in peaceful activities. They're encouraged to engage in trade, because violence is counterproductive to a harmonious society where people more or less get along, in the sense that they're not lopping each other's heads off. So the incentives are rather apparent, readily apparent, I think. When people aren't actively hurting each other, everyone feels better, usually. People might not like each other, but, chopping each other's heads off, burning people alive, etc. These are generally activities we frown upon because, who wants to be in that situation? It doesn't help make people happy, and it certainly doesn't help people get along with each other. And modern society reflects that. We have, over time, changed into a world where that sort of barbarity is not tolerated, and our punishments have become increasingly docile, if you will, compared to the punishments of yore. And we can see that, yes, human beings are naturally violent, and we rechannel that violence oftentimes in the form of, say, video games. We watch violent entertainment. The impulses are all there, but they have, in some sense, been conditioned out of us, I think, by sheer necessity. Because if any of us wants to live in a civil society, we have to conform to its laws and its rules, and not inflicting harm on others, and particularly egregious harm, such as the violence of the days of yore, that's beneficial. That kind of violence, that sort of extreme violence, disrupts the harmony we have in society, and it just doesn't work as well as trying to get along with each other and trying to engage in peaceful trade and talk, and trying to use one's mind to get ahead instead of one's brute force. And we've learned to shed a lot of our natural violent tendencies, the overt ones at least, the overt violent tendencies, in favor of a more peaceful and harmonious society. It's far, far from perfect, and there are many other things to talk about in a separate video, but nonetheless, we've been successful at that, especially compared to back in the day. You can just Google any sort of tortures of the ancient world or what have you, and you can see the kinds of things we've been doing to people. It's absolutely horrifying. Anyone's interested, look up the pear. The pear is a torture instrument. I'm not going to tell you about the pear, but you don't want the pear in your mouth, put it that way. Now, we can look at this and say, wow, look at all that progress we've made. Look at how far we have come. You see, we can do it. We can recline back into our minds and take control of our instincts, and we can be less violent. And overall, we are less violent. And what violence remains, we tend to rechannel in peaceful outlets such as video games, a virtual reality where no one is harmed, or watching film, which is all just acting, etc. And of course, we could do the same with our gynocentric instincts, with our desires to favor the limiting factor in reproduction, the human female. But here's the problem. The two exist in a state of non-equivalence. Let's just briefly return to the fact that violence is incredibly destructive, especially the kind of violence we witnessed in the 20th century, such as the incineration effect that the atom bombs created in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's readily apparent to everyone that we don't really want to live in a world where those things are happening all the time. It's obvious. Most people who are neurologically stable, I'm not talking about people who are naturally violent. There are people who are unfortunately born into the world with a neurology that makes them commit violence. They're just naturally violent people. But most people who are normative in their neurological state of mind, if you will, they don't do those sorts of things, and they don't want to live in a world like that. It's obvious. Violence is generally a bad thing. It doesn't really help us, and there are other ways of getting around in the world and other ways of making progress for oneself and for others. But here we have this thing we call gynocentrism, which is, at the end of the day, is simply preferring the life of the limiting factor in reproduction to the life of the non-limiting factor in reproduction, in this case, the human female versus the human male. And it is by no means as obvious, and this is why this is non-equivalent. The violence analogy compared to, we can learn to restrain our gynocentric instincts, etc., there's no equivalence, because gynocentrism, our natural inclinations to favor human women over human men, this is not something that's obvious to people. It's not even obvious to people after it's pointed out with data and history and information. They rail against it. They struggle with it. They simply cannot get their heads around it. They cannot wrap their heads around it. And this is the primary reason why these are not equivalent to each other, and why using this as an analogy, in the sense of, yes, we can progress to point X, and now we can progress to point Y, is a bad argument. Remember, most people are not aware of their instinctual hardwiring. They don't know what their natural inclinations are. Women don't know they have in-group preference. They just exhibit it and act it out. And men don't know that they have an out-group preference towards women. They just exhibit it and act it out. This needs to be pointed out to people, and they still don't get it, and they still cannot understand it, and they do it anyway. And we see this over and over and over again. How many videos back in the day had Girl Rights What made? I mean, anyone with a brain, in theory, could have watched a couple of her videos and said, she's making some good points. She's providing some interesting data. Maybe there's something to it. They could have done some research, and then, wow, maybe the world isn't the way we've been taught and told it is. Maybe it is quite different, in fact. But that's very, very rarely the case. It's so not obvious that even people who are engaged in opposing feminism can't understand or recognize the origins of feminism and why it is continually fueled and how it all got started. In fact, we're so inclined to believe what women say, just as an example, that feminism was able to get off the ground in the first place. I mean, especially second wave feminism, which is just chock full of narrative lies about the course of human history and the state of human affairs. And we have two options. Either people just bought it and believed it because women were telling the stories, or they just rather cynically didn't and didn't really care and wanted the votes and the support. So maybe that's why they did it. But I'm inclined to believe that the former is more true than the latter, although certainly there were cases for the latter. We intuitively believe the stories of women. We feel that we should pay greater heed to what they're saying. This is not a product, as many have claimed, of simple social conditioning. And I will make a video, several videos next month if I'm still alive, covering this supposed dichotomy between the social and the biological, because it's not even a dichotomy, and in the human sciences it's not even recognized. It's a faux debate. It doesn't even exist. But yes, of course, violence, inclinations to violence are biological, but because of the destructive outcome of violence, and because that destructive outcome is so obvious, we tend not to engage in it in these days because we prefer a more civilized and harmonious world, generally speaking. But that's just not the case with our instincts to favor the limiting factor in reproduction. The limiting factor in reproduction has been with us for hundreds of thousands of years, and still further back if you consider our hominid ancestors. Well, what do? We certainly cannot just turn it off like a switch. And more, as I just said, the benefits of turning off that particular hardware, that operating system we have, that particular aspect of the operating system, are not only not readily apparent, most people aren't even aware they have this operating system running. It's just they're oblivious to it, and they need to be pointed. It needs to be pointed out to them, and even when it's pointed out to them, they resist and ignore it and deny it, etc. The two are absolutely not equivalent. And one could argue, well, we have these guys called men going their own way, and this is evidence or proof that, yeah, we can turn it off. But if you look at men going their own way as a phenomenon, this is, as I think Coltrane has argued, this is the same thing as saying, well, suicide, the existence of suicide proves that people have no desire to actually can overcome their desire to live, and that most people don't want to live because, well, there's suicide. It's a bad argument on a lot of levels. And even amongst men going their own way, I mean, like I said, this is not me passing judgment at all. I'm just saying very few men swear off women completely, which I think that would be the ultimate step in rejecting any sort of favoritism or desire to interact with women. That's personally up to the man going his own way. I think anything is fine as long as you're not married. But I'm just saying that if you interact with women, you're going to have to, on some level, cater to her desires. I mean, the chances that you find a woman who's just going to, obey you, suck your dick, and you tell her to shut the fuck up and leave, while sharing nothing with her and doing nothing for her, are slim to none. So, what is obvious about violence is not obvious about gynocentrism or favoring the limiting factor in reproduction. And the existence of MGTOW is also not a proof that anyone can do it, any more than the existence of suicide is a proof that people don't have a desire to live. Most people do have a desire to live, and most people don't commit suicide. And even most people attempting suicide have a lot of doubts and struggle with it. It is an extremely, extremely difficult thing to do. And frankly speaking, even speaking of myself, I don't really deal with women. Maybe one day I'm put in a situation where it's inevitable, and I might have to deal with some very terrifying specters of the past, specters that my hominid ancestors had placed in me, as it were, or at least evolution. And I'll have to deal with some of these natural inclinations. Might happen, it might not. But one thing we should be keenly aware of is that this is not the same thing. And more importantly, I think most importantly, you know how long it took to get rid of all of that violence. We are only now, at this point in time, becoming a more peaceful, more civilized society. I mean, the 20th century, the most violent century in the history of mankind. And certainly not in terms of body count, but the centuries preceding it, the millennia preceding it, just unmitigated barbarism across the board. And only now do we come to a point where we think it's probably better not to do that sort of stuff. And in the last few years, just the last few years, there's some small subsector of humanity, some incredibly tiny subsector of humanity that is becoming aware of an asymmetry between the sexes, and a very pointed one, and a very sharp one, and an asymmetry in the way we treat each other. based on our sex and based on our gender. Only now is it becoming actually apparent, and only now is it being described accurately. And if you count some of the academic literature, well, I'm talking about real academic literature, not feminism, maybe the last 20, 30 years since Evo Psych has been around, give or take. But let us not forget, I mean, this is brand new to most people. A couple of years? I mean, it's one thing to realize that marriage is bad for you. It's another thing to realize that, holy shit, there's this massive asymmetry going on, and all of it has to do with the way we evolved and our different reproductive needs and wants and requirements. And this has led to an incredible splintering of how we operate and how we interact with each other. Most people aren't even aware of it. And even people who touch upon the topic of feminism, people like Sargon of Akkad and the others, they can't name a spade for whatever reasons. They cannot. I mean, how many times, this has been brought up by Barbaros and me a number of times, we're one of the few people to say, look, the fairly recent, say the last 10 years, popularity of comic books, in particular video games, has transformed the whole scene. I mean, I was just watching a Vice documentary on esports in South Korea, and it's growing in proportions, and people are projecting it's going to out people and outscore the popularity of more conventional sports such as American football or baseball or what have you. I mean, we're talking about something that used to be a niche that is just becoming massive. And as we've talked about in the past, what did we see? We saw an influx of women because women are drawn to wealth and fame and status like a moth is drawn to flame, or as shite draws flies, as the Scots like to say. But we can honestly talk about and say that, but what do other people do? They don't. They talk about feminism. I mean, what is Gamergate at the end of the day really about, right? Gamergate is, you're opposing feminism and all sorts of unnecessary interpolations and insertions into gaming and blah, blah, blah. But none of this would have been around if gaming were not popular. If gaming were not popular, if it remained a kind of nerd niche under the basement kind of thing, well, that wouldn't have happened. Do you see any of this going on with tabletop Dungeons and Dragons? Of course, barring the odd nerd girl that did exist and still exists, women want nothing to do with it, and they still want nothing to do with it. But not gaming, and you have the cosplay and all this stuff. Why? Because it's popular, and we can understand how it works and why women are getting involved. Because, they're attracted to status and wealth and fame and money, because this brings them security, and, we understand the mechanics. Very few people are allowed to say that out loud, aloud, and the people who are saying it, and the people who do say it, they're usually not listened to. And the people most involved in this particular phenomenon, I'm talking about this because it is relevant, say Gamergate, don't talk about it openly. They don't try to go back to the origins and the source. So people like that are fighting a boogeyman. They're fighting this unnecessary insertion that some people, particularly females, tend to engage in games. And of course, they're white knight male allies. But they're still ignorant of the source and the origins and how it all came about. Because I remember when gaming was just really geeky, and I certainly remember when comic books were really, really geeky. And, you were just a nerd who did it. The local comic book store in the Bronx where I grew up, you didn't see women there. You saw geeks in glasses. I've never worn glasses, but the other guys. It just wasn't a cool thing. We all loved the comic books, but it wasn't cool in the eyes of the public and the eyes of the many. Why am I talking about this? The point is, it's just so not obvious to people how these things work, and even when it's pointed out to them, they're either in denial or still can't grasp it. And this is why there is no equivalence between our ability to curb our violence for the sake of harmony, cooperation, and the greater good, if you will, and something such as gynocentrism and the natural tendency of the female to try to invade male spaces, etc. It's not talked about because people aren't even aware of it. And even when it's pointed out to them, they don't get it, and they're just at a loss, and they'll argue with you, and that's why this is an uphill battle. Is there any hope? I hate that word, hope, but I think there is a form of hope, if you will. I think the best thing we can do is continue educating all men certainly, and even women on humanity, human beings, how they came to be. To that is essential evolution, human psychology, how it all came to be, how we ended up where we are right now. But even that might not be enough, because we've been trying, and we still are met with resistance because people cannot wrap their heads around it. So the problem with this analogy, on a final note, is there's just no equivalence. Violence is overtly bad. It tends to destroy things. People tend not to benefit on the whole. And that's why one of the major reasons, if not the major reasons, for us having reduced it. The same can't be applied to something that's essentially invisible. It's a specter. Gynocentrism might as well be a specter in the eyes of many, and people don't even know it exists. Hell, most of us didn't know it existed and didn't even know about what we were doing a few years back until we became aware of these things. How are we going to fix this when it's just so rooted in us and so inaccessible to us, despite the attempts of a few to point it out? I frankly don't know, but I think it's better that we proceed in an intellectually honest manner and not try to create false equivalencies between things that are very different, both in their appearance and outcome. So, having said that, I will end this video here, and I hope to see you soon. As always, may the gods go with you. Bye-bye.